Good afternoon, colleagues. First item of business today is First Minister's questions, and before we turn to the questions themselves, may I invite the First Minister to update the Parliament on the situation with COVID.
Thank you. I will give a very quick update on today's statistics. 500 new cases were reported yesterday. That's 2.5% of all tests that were carried out, and the total number of confirmed cases is now 204,055. 726 people are in hospital. That's 24 fewer than yesterday, and 69 people in intensive care, which is 1 fewer than yesterday. I regret to report that in the past 24 hours, a further 24 deaths were registered. And in addition to that, 3 other deaths that were registered recently but not yet included in the published total have been added. So those 3 deaths, together with the 24 registered yesterday, mean that the total number of people who have sadly died using our daily measurement is now 7,398. Once again, I want to send my deepest condolences to all those who have lost a loved one. We will also publish the latest estimate of the R number later today and expect it to show again that the R number is below 1, and that reflects the positive trends that we can all see in the daily figures right now. And I'll also just give a quick update on the vaccination programme. As of 8:30 this morning, 1,688,808 people have received their first dose of the vaccine. That's an increase of 26,729 since yesterday. In addition, 100,058 people have also now received their second dose. That's an increase of 7,508 since yesterday, which means that in total yesterday, 34,237 people received vaccinations. 95% of 65 to 69-year-olds have now had a first dose, as have 37% of 60 to 64-year-olds, 31% of 55 to 59-year-olds, and 26% of 50 to 54-year-olds, an age group that is of particular interest to me, Presiding Officer. We still expect to be able to offer first doses to everyone over 50, to all unpaid carers, and all adults with an underlying health condition by mid-April. I think, taking all of what I have just reported, there is little doubt that things are, at the moment, firmly heading in the right direction. The number of cases is falling, the numbers in hospital are falling, and the vaccination programme is progressing extremely well. That's why we've been able to set out the timetable for children's return to school, and next week I'll outline any further changes that we feel we can make at this stage to the level 4 restrictions. And then the following week I will provide more information about the timetable for easing restrictions after the 26th of April. So there's much to feel optimistic about right now, but I want to stress that should not see us throw caution to the wind. Case numbers do remain high, and of course the new variant remains highly infectious. So for the moment, if we want to continue this progress, my advice to everyone is to continue to abide by the stay-at-home rule. Stay at home except for essential purposes, follow facts when you are out, and make sure that collectively we continue to keep everything going in the right direction. So my thanks to everybody who's doing that and sticking with it during these difficult times.
Thank you very much, First Minister. Could I encourage any member who wishes to ask a question of the First Minister to press their request to speak button as soon as possible, and I call on Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to ask the First Minister about the legal advice on the Salmond inquiry, because despite this Parliament voting for it to be released 4 months ago, it was only partially revealed this week. The Ministerial Code makes clear in section 2.30 that ministers must act lawfully, informed of the legal considerations, and that the legal implications of any course of action are considered at the earliest opportunity. And this part, acting early on legal implications, is important. So let's go through the timeline. 9 weeks before conceding the judicial review, legal advice stated that the case was more likely to fail than succeed. The First Minister chose to go forward. A month before conceding, legal advice said the least worst option was to stop, because otherwise, and I quote, expenses will be far higher. The First Minister chose the worst option. 19 days before conceding, the Lord Advocate, government and external lawyers all said the case was not even stateable, the minimum requirement. The First Minister dug her heels in. So will she tell us, to quote the words of her own legal counsel, why did the government try to defend the indefensible for so long?
First Minister.
Well, I think as anybody who paid any attention to lengthy proceedings yesterday, which clearly didn't include Ruth Davidson, will have seen that's just simply not true. On December the 11th, the law officers were very clear in the The information on this has been published, and I think the quote from the law officer summarised in the note that was published in advance of yesterday was that there was no question that the case should be dropped. On the contrary, there were credible arguments to be made across the petition, including on the issue of the appointment of the investigating officer. So that was the position of the law officers. Things started to go wrong, seriously wrong in the case in the days that followed, and then due process was followed that led to a decision on the part of the government to concede the case. So that is there for anybody with an open mind to look at. I think the Deputy First Minister has undertaken to provide some further information to the committee, which will happen, and the Parliament can look at that. I answered questions for 8 hours on this yesterday. I answered every question that was put to me, and so, Presiding Officer, I intend now to rest on that, to allow both the committee and the inquiry on the Ministerial Code to conclude their work. In the meantime, I'm going to get on with the job I suspect most people watching at home right now want me to get on with, which is leading this country through and out of a pandemic. And I'll leave Ruth Davidson and the Conservatives to play the political games that they seem to prioritise over everything else.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister characterised this as political games, but I have never forgotten the women who were failed at the heart of this inquiry. And the thing that the First Minister cannot get away from is that it was her government that failed them, and that questions still require to be answered. And First Minister, it's not up for question if the government ignored legal advice and cost taxpayers' money. What's being argued is how long and how much was wasted. And this is what's truly incredible. The view of legal counsel was, and I quote, based on the facts as then known. And First Minister, this government didn't even give its own lawyers the facts. Advocates Roddy Dunlop and Christine O'Neill stated this: we have each experienced extreme professional embarrassment. On instruction, they made plainly and demonstrably untrue statements before a judge. Documents were withheld from those QCs, which were highly relevant yet undisclosed. They called that unexplained and frankly inexplicable. They refused to, and I quote, rehearse the regrettable way in which the document disclosure has unfolded. So I'll ask the First Minister to rehearse it for us now. Will she confirm that the withheld documents were precisely the ones that made this case unstateable?
First Minister.
Firstly, I'm going to agree with something that Ruth Davidson said. I agree that she has not forgotten the women at the heart of this, because I don't think Ruth Davidson ever remembered the women at the heart of this. The legal advice is there for everyone to see, and people with an open mind, which doesn't include Ruth Davidson, can look at that. Now, Ruth Davidson says that she's not playing political games. I beg to differ. I think we saw the true colours of the Conservatives yesterday. First of all, on Tuesday night, they said this. I don't know if Ruth Davidson approved this comment or not, but the Conservatives said in terms that it did not matter what I said before a parliamentary committee yesterday because they had already made up their minds. It's not about due process, it's political desperation on the part of the Conservatives. But, Presiding Officer, I think we also had a glimpse of some of the values at play with the Conservatives yesterday, because during that committee session, one of the Tory members on it seemed to be suggesting that I should have intervened in the process to effectively sweep the allegations against Mr Salmond under the carpet. And then the other Conservative member asks me to apologise for the inappropriate behaviour of a man. So there we have the Tories, I think, demonstrating without any help from me that they are indeed playing political games. So while they do that, I say again, 8 hours of evidence to a committee. It's time to allow the committee and the independent inquiry into the Ministerial Code to do their job. And in the meantime, I'm going to go on with my job of leading this country through COVID and out of lockdown.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer.
Order, please.
But the First Minister can't get away from the fact that this chamber is an organ of this Parliament. And this chamber only saw the legal advice that this chamber voted for 4 months ago this week. And we have every right to question a First Minister who is the head of a government who failed these 2 women. And First Minister, I want everyone to understand how incompetent and secretive this government is. Legal counsel was provided with 1 email in a chain. It was a crucial element to their defence. But they were not given the next email, sent less than half an hour later, in the same chain. It was withheld, and when it was finally handed over, it was one of the final straws, and her lawyers had to threaten to resign to force the government's hand. Presiding Officer, that information was available the whole time. The government could have passed it to their lawyers in September or October or November, but they withheld it. They kept it secret, and it cost them months and all of us £500,000 of taxpayers' money. First Minister, why was the crucial evidence withheld for months from the government's own legal team?
First Minister.
The case ultimately collapsed because information came to light. I set that out in the committee yesterday, and people can judge by looking at the advice that was published themselves. And of course the committee will come to its conclusions, as will the independent inquiry on the ministerial code, and I await the findings of both. But again, if I can try to strike a note of consensus, because I do believe in the importance of this democratic institution. By the time I sit down after this session of First Minister's questions today, I will have been subjected, rightly and properly, to 10 hours of parliamentary scrutiny over the course of this week. That's me doing my job in discharging my responsibilities. But can I gently point out to Ruth Davidson that this democratic institution that she extols the virtues of is the same democratic institution that she is about to depart to take up a seat in the unelected House of Lords. I think people across this country are becoming heartily sick of the soon-to-be Baroness Davidson lecturing anybody else on democracy.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, because of the legal advice that had to be dragged from this government under threat of a vote of no confidence, we know that for weeks this government were definitively and beyond any doubt ignoring legal advice. But the case only became unstateable so late because this government withheld crucial documents for so long. They withheld documents from their own lawyers, they withheld them from the court, and they continue to withhold them from this Parliament. And what we've already seen shows that there's no argument if this government ignored legal advice. They did. The argument is if it did so for 3 weeks or for more than 3 months. There's no argument if the First Minister was at fault for losing more than £500,000 of taxpayers' money. The argument is only about how much she's to blame for. And there's no argument if Nicola Sturgeon broke the ministerial code. The argument is only about how badly she broke it. We believe that the sanction is to go. Why doesn't she?
First Minister.
Well, I think Ruth Davidson has just shown her true colours and the Conservative true colours all over again. Because, of course, she stands up here and says scrutiny and democracy and due process is really important. But just as on Tuesday night, the Conservatives prejudged my evidence to the parliamentary inquiry, she's just prejudged the outcome of the independent inquiry into the ministerial code. This is just about desperate political games for the Conservatives. I suspect their private polling is even more desperate than the public polling right now, because remember, the people of Scotland have been voting no confidence in the Conservatives since the 1950s, and I think we're about to see why. So I'll go on with my job. I'll let the inquiries do their job. I've not prejudged them. Ruth Davidson clearly has. But I will also, in a few weeks, subject myself to the ultimate scrutiny. The scrutiny and the verdict of the people of Scotland, the verdict that matters most. And as I do so, Ruth Davidson will be slinking off to the House of Lords.
Thank you. Question to Anna Sala.
Can I start by offering my condolences to all the families impacted by COVID-19, and particularly those that have lost a loved one. Presiding Officer, the exchanges we have just heard represent the worst of our politics. Each day, each and every single one of us come into this chamber and we sit in front of that mace inscribed with the ideals of this Parliament. Wisdom, compassion, justice and integrity. Principles that have been undermined when the government failed the women who submitted claims of harassment. Undermined by the government's refusal to hand over all documentation to the committee investigating these failures. And undermined by the government ignoring 2 votes of this Parliament calling for all the legal advice to be published. The government keeps telling us they have nothing to hide, but when this Parliament twice demanded legal advice be published, they refused. And when it was finally released, it was partial and came just hours before the First Minister's appearance. Wisdom, compassion, justice and integrity. First Minister, why did it take the threat of a no-confidence vote in the Deputy First Minister for your government to act?
First Minister.
Well, the importance for all governments of being able to take proper legal advice, I think, should be understood by everybody across this chamber. And the government, rightly now, given the allegations that have been levelled at it, have published that legal advice, and people can now look at that legal advice and draw their own conclusions. Now, I say again, I sat in front of a parliamentary committee. I'm not sure if there is any other member of this chamber has done likewise ever. I sat in front of a parliamentary committee for 8 hours, as is my duty and obligation, answered questions that were put to me and put the case of the government. I also apologised, as I will do again, to the women who were let down by the mistake that the government made. So I think it is now right and proper, and I think it is in line with the principles on that mace, which I, like all of us, hold dear, is that we allow the inquiry to do its work. We allow the independent inquiry into the ministerial code to do its work, and we allow me to get on with the job I believe the majority of the country want me to focus on now, which is to continue to steer this country through a global pandemic so that we can get through COVID, come out of lockdown and get back to normality. And that is what I intend to focus on while these inquiries conclude their work.
And Sarwar.
First Minister, that answer would have more credibility if all of the legal advice was published before you gave evidence, not legal advice after you give evidence. Now, the First Minister has rightly had the opportunity to address the committee yesterday, and I do agree with her. It is important that all parties are given due process and that we do not prejudice the outcome of the inquiry. With that in mind, within the coming weeks, James Hamilton QC will present his report on potential breaches of the ministerial code to the government. The outcome of this report will be crucial in establishing the facts about what happened. The wholly unacceptable and disgraceful situation we have had with the legal advice cannot be repeated with the Hamilton report. So can the First Minister give the people of Scotland a cast-iron guarantee that the government will release the report without delay or obstruction on the day it is handed over by James Hamilton QC?
First Minister.
Yes.
And Sarwar.
I welcome that commitment from the First Minister, but remember this, we will hold her to that promise. Because the First Minister is right, this is about transparency and there can be no delay in publishing this report. The Ministerial Code exists to uphold standards in public life. It is there to protect the integrity of the office of the First Minister, of all Scottish ministers and the whole of the Scottish Government. In her foreword to the Ministerial Code, the First Minister says, and I quote, "I will lead by example in following the letter and spirit of this code, and I expect all ministers and civil servants to do likewise." Wisdom, compassion, justice and integrity. In that light, does the First Minister agree, removing party and personality, that a minister, any minister who is found in breach of the Ministerial Code should resign?
First Minister.
I will uphold my words in the foreword to the Ministerial Code. I will uphold the principles on that mace, but I will also demand the right to due process, which one party at least is not prepared to give me. So let's wait and see what the outcome of the inquiries are. They will be published, and then we can debate in this chamber the outcome of that. I sat before that committee, I answered every question, and I will give the committee and the inquiry the opportunity now to do their work.
Thank you. Question 3, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I put on record my congratulations to Anas Sarwar on his election as leader of the Scottish Labour Party and welcome him to his role in FMQs. The Greens do want to see both inquiries completed, but in the meantime, we are still focused on the public health crisis, and I think that's what most of the public want of us. This week, we're marking a year since the first COVID-19 case was recorded in Scotland, and since then, more than 9,500 deaths have been documented by the National Records of Scotland. Every single one of us will share in an expression of condolence to all those who've been affected by that tragic loss. And a year on from that first case, we are now faced with a new threat in the form of the so-called Brazilian variant, which has already been identified both in Scotland and in England. The strain has also been identified in 15 non-red list countries, showing that the UK government's approach to quarantine is dangerously inadequate. It's been reported that the effort to trace contacts who may have been exposed to this new variant has been hampered by the provision of incomplete data. So it's clear that the current approach to international travel, including via connections within the UK, is not yet enough to keep us safe as the virus continues to change. What further action is the Scottish Government planning to ensure that we protect the public from importation of new forms of this virus?
First Minister.
Well, we continue to think that international travel restrictions are essential. The travel restrictions we have in place are more stringent than is the case in other parts of the UK. We do have a concern. I have articulated this concern on numerous occasions that difference leaves weaknesses in our defence against importation of the virus. So we will continue to work with the UK Government to try to fill those gaps and to try to encourage a more uniform position. But we will continue to do everything we can to make sure those protections at our borders are as strict as they need to be, because it is absolutely the case that the key risk we face as we suppress the virus here at home and vaccinate more people is new variants coming into the country that potentially undermine the efficacy of the vaccine. So this is one of the most serious challenges and top priorities that we have in the weeks to come.
Patrick Harvey.
In addition to these reports of incomplete contact tracing data in Scotland, there are also reports of a lost case in England. And it's also likely that this variant may be present in other countries, but without having been identified yet. The ongoing importance of our test, trace and isolate systems therefore cannot be overstated. This will continue to be vital even as the vaccine programme is delivered at pace. We know that in the face of new variants, it's more important than ever that anyone developing symptoms, not just new arrivals, are able to access a test and are supported to immediately self-isolate. Following pressure from the Greens, the self-isolation grant is being expanded, but we've repeatedly asked the Scottish Government and the First Minister about accommodation for people needing to self-isolate. Freedom of information responses show that in the 10 months up to mid-January, only 7 people from 3 local authorities were provided hotel accommodation to self-isolate. Can the First Minister confirm whether there has been any progress at all on this, or if this form of support is still close to non-existent? Because it would be tragic if we allowed new variants to spread simply because people face barriers to doing the right thing.
First Minister.
That support is there if people need it. Local authorities have the ability, and there is work done to identify the needs of people who are being asked to self-isolate, and that can, if necessary, include accommodation. I will certainly take steps to see if there's more we can do to promote the awareness of that so that people know of the availability of it. But we should not, and Patrick Harvey is right here, we should take care to ensure that we are not risking the spread of the virus through the lack of availability of the support people need to self-isolate, and that's something we take seriously. As we go into this next phase, as hopefully cases fall, we can start to come out of lockdown, vaccination will continue to do its job. Importation and the risk of outbreaks will remain the key threats we face, and these factors, test and protect, self-isolation will come back to the fore as the key weapons we have in our arsenal to keep COVID at bay. So Patrick Harvey's right to raise these, and the Government will continue to do everything we can to make sure all of that is available.
Willie Rennie.
I want to warmly welcome Anas Sarwar to his place in the chamber today. There may have been 8 hours of questioning yesterday, but there are still areas of outstanding concern. Forgetting about a meeting, having a different recollection of another meeting, keeping meetings from the Permanent Secretary, and not acting swiftly on a claimed leak of a complainer's name. But the First Minister is right that this is a matter for the committee and for the independent investigator to untangle these matters. But there is one lesson that we should all be able to learn today. It should not take the threat to the job of the Deputy First Minister before the Government complies with the will of this Parliament to release the legal advice it voted for months ago. Those who worked for decades to establish the Scottish Parliament did not do so for this to be flouted by a belligerent and secretive 14-year-old government more interested in defending itself than aiding the process of democracy. Why can't she see that that needs to change?
First Minister.
In some ways, I'm afraid I'm going to have to agree to disagree with Willie Rennie. After the parliamentary votes, the Deputy First Minister had a process of discussion with the committee which actually led to the committee having access to summaries of the legal advice that the government had had, and earlier this week that advice was published. But there is a really important principle as well underpinning the need for governments to be able to take proper legal advice and for the confidentiality of that. Governments all over, certainly the UK and indeed much of the world, rely on that principle as well. So there are many lessons to be learned here. I certainly do not dispute that, but we have to make sure that we learn those lessons in the round. And this Parliament also, I think, has a role to play in ensuring that some of these principles that are in place for the good governance that any administration in the future need are properly respected and given their place as well.
Willie Rennie.
I am disappointed that the First Minister's digging in on this, because it's been 2 weeks since the Parliament voted for the OECD education report to be published. The First Minister said we should judge her on her record on education. But that can't be done if such an important report is hidden from the voters at the election. The Government already has the report, but the Deputy First Minister has still not released it. Do we have to threaten another motion of no confidence in John Swinney to force him to respect the will of this Parliament?
First Minister.
So it seems here that the opposition want to, pick and choose the principles that they want us to abide by. There is a really important reason why governments have to have the ability to take confidential legal advice. But Willie Rennie is also now asking us to dictate to an independent organisation, the OECD no less, what the timetable of the publication of a report that they have been asked to produce should be. If we were to do that, Willie Rennie, I am pretty certain, would be one of the first to be getting to his feet in this chamber saying how outrageous it was that we were intervening in an independent process that we had asked the OECD to undertake. So there are a range of principles here that governments have to abide by, and we will continue to do that in the overall interest of the good governance of the country. And thankfully, perhaps, in a few weeks' time, the people of Scotland are going to get the opportunity to cast their verdict on all of this. And then all of us participating in this session here, with one exception, of course, will put ourselves before the Scottish people. And the Scottish people can have their say and their verdict. And that's the verdict, of course, that we should all respect and abide by.
Thank you. Question 5, John Mason.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the UK budget.
First Minister.
Well, yesterday's delayed budget confirmed additional net funding of £1.175 billion for the Scottish budget, which is welcome. The majority of that has already been factored into our own budget proposals that are currently under consideration by Parliament. We welcome some of the individual announcements, the extension of the furlough scheme and self-employed support, but the Chancellor's business support measures are significantly less generous than those proposed by the Government, and notably there was little further to support health recovery or any significant new help for families in need. And of course the confirmation that the Levelling Up Fund will indeed undermine the devolution settlement is particularly unwelcome. Nevertheless, we will work with these implications to build, I hope, consensus within this chamber for our budget bill in the coming days.
John Mason.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. The TUC has said that the Chancellor is gambling with the recovery. More specifically, our capital budget has been cut and was not restored yesterday. Can she say anything about that? Because it seems to me that capital investment in housing and other things both creates jobs and gives us assets for this country.
First Minister.
Well, John Mason is absolutely right on this point. I mean, capital spending is, of course, key to economic recovery. And as a result of the budget yesterday, our capital grant for 2021-22 remains lower than it was in 2020-2021. That is disappointing because that is, as I say, one of the key levers we have to support recovery through investment in infrastructure. As we set out in our own budget, the government here is doing what it can to mitigate that cut. We've maximised our capital borrowing and, of course, we've drawn down £200 million of financial transaction capital from the Scottish Reserve. That reduces the impact of the 66% cut in the financial transaction budget we received from the UK Government Spending Review. So we are doing what we can to mitigate that, but the cut in capital funding is deeply regrettable and will have consequences for the pace of economic recovery.
Thank you very much. Question number 6, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to protect and strengthen social connection in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic.
First Minister.
The pandemic has hit everyone extremely hard, but social connections have possibly suffered more than much else. The focus we have is to achieve balance between suppression and recognising the social harm of loneliness and isolation. We've invested to tackle loneliness and social isolation right from the start of the pandemic through a range of different support streams. In addition, the Connecting Scotland programme will invest a further £43 million in addressing digital exclusion with a focus on low-income households, older and disabled people. I think in recent days we've all been moved by pictures of residents in care homes reunited with loved ones, and I hope as we ease out of the current restrictions, all of us are going to enjoy seeing more of those people we love most.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the First Minister for that response? She may be aware of the Talk Together report, which highlights that extended isolation across all of society is having a profound effect on both the physical and mental health of our population. That lack of social interaction points to a significant escalation of a health crisis that was already under strain prior to the pandemic. One of the crucial elements, of course, of the solution is the third sector, both in terms of those organisations offering mental health support, as well as those who deliver organised sport, art, music, etc. So can I ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government plans to not only ensure that these essential services are still there and fully functioning after COVID, but also how the Scottish Government is actively planning to encourage re-engagement with a society that for the past year has been out of that habit of participating?
First Minister.
Well, on a financial basis, obviously our budget facilitates support for many of the organisations and activities that Brian Whittle has spoken about. I think he raises an important point, one that is certainly in our minds, but I think it is one we need to think more about, and it goes beyond the funding for social connections, and it is about how we help people get back to ways of living that have perhaps become less normal for people, and I think that is something that will perhaps take time, but something that the government will continue to pay a lot of attention to, and on that I know that there will be many ideas across the chamber that we will also want to reflect on.
Thank you. Question number 7, David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to reports that Scotland faces a penalty of up to £190 million because of irregularities in its EU structural fund spending.
First Minister.
Well, since 2014, the Scottish Government has allocated over £700 million of European structural funds to support thousands of people and communities, investing in low carbon projects, helping people with training and skills development, and supporting vital local charities. That funding has been pivotal in supporting smart, sustainable and inclusive growth over a number of years. The Scottish Government does not face a penalty of up to £190 million in relation to its European Structural Fund spending. The figure is based on a worst-case scenario of both the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund remaining in suspension. As the Public Finance Minister, Ivan McKee, has already advised Parliament, the European Regional Development Fund suspension was lifted by the Commission in December 2020, and we are continuing to work closely with the Commission to progress the lifting of the European Social Fund suspension.
David Stewart.
Thank you, President Officer, and I'm grateful for the very detailed response from the First Minister. The First Minister will, of course, be well aware that my region, Highlands and Islands, has been one of the UK's top 3 beneficiaries of structural funds, from the Keswick Bridge to the University of the Highlands and Islands, funding which has sustained and developed the local economy. However, the European Commission has expressed concern for years about 2 points: weaknesses in the verification checks by the Scottish Government and the failure to meet annual spending targets. Could the First Minister explain why the situation was not resolved, which is now resulting in millions of pounds being lost to the Highlands Islands and indeed the rest of Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, these are issues that the Scottish Government works closely with the European Commission on. Clearly, these are often highly technical matters, but we were, as I said in my original answer, pleased to be in a position where the ERDF suspension was lifted in December. I'll ask Ivan McKee to write to the member in more detail about the steps we're taking to address some of the criticisms that have been made and to give reassurance on these matters.
Thank you. We'll turn to supplementary questions. Colin Beattie, to be followed by Oliver Mundell.
Can I ask the First Minister whether there will be a reconsideration of mass vaccination venues as the main premises for vaccinating people with learning disabilities and autism, and instead consider assigning these to GPs, given that this would be a more familiar environment for those who may otherwise experience sensory overload?
First Minister.
Well, we will certainly keep the approach under review and offer those with learning and intellectual disabilities vaccination at their GPs or at another suitable location. We've also put plans in place to ensure learning disability nurses will be available to support vaccination for this group. A walk-through video of vaccination centres has been prepared to assist those with learning disabilities and autism who plan to attend a larger vaccination centre. As ever, if anyone is invited to vaccination at a location that might not be suitable for them, for whatever reason, they can make alternative arrangements by contacting the helpline.
Oliver Mundell, to be followed by Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the First Minister offer any reassurance to my constituents who are struggling to get any information regarding their applications to the Mobile and Home-Based Close Contact Services Fund and the newly self-employed Hardship Fund? Many have had no acknowledgement, others have been rejected without any explanation, and more still are waiting on a follow-up in the next 7 to 10 days. Given the known issues with these schemes, can she guarantee that the funds will remain open until all applications have been processed correctly? And what advice does she give to those who are worried that while they're waiting for these applications to be processed, they may miss out on the opportunity to apply for local authority discretionary funding?
First Minister.
Well, in general terms, I want to give the assurance that nobody will miss out on funding that they are entitled to because of administrative issues. I'll ask the Finance Secretary to write to the member with some more information on the specific funds that he has raised and any issues that are being experienced there. But we will continue to support business for as long as is required as we hopefully in the next couple of months come out of lockdown and see businesses start to trade normally again.
Thank you. Elaine Smith, to be